Next up, we're going to look at the picker view. The picker view is a little bit more complex than some of the controls we've already looked at. It allows the user to pick something from a list, which is very similar to the date picker. In fact, the date picker descends from the picker view. But in using the picker view, we're going to use a concept called delegates. And that's a little bit different than what we've seen before. We'll be using them a lot when we get into lists and tables. So I've set this up already. I have my picker view control, and by default it gives us some towns, but that's not really what we want to see. I've also set up some outlets. So I've set up a referencing outlet, and that's our normal kind of outlet that we're used to. Then we also have a couple of other outlets, a data source and a delegate. And what I did to set these up was I simply dragged over from the outlet towards the picker, and that created the data source and the delegate. The odd thing is you don't actually see anything in code for that. So it's a little strange that way, but you do see it in the storyboard. The next thing I have to do to set up those delegates for the data source and the picker view is to change the classes that my view controller descends from. Normally, it just descends from UI view controller. But now I've added Uipicker view data source and Uipicker view delegate. So I have to implement some of the members of Uipicker view delegate for this to work. So initially when you add these, you're going to get an error. And we'll talk about what we need to implement in just a bit. The next thing I did was I created an array of towns, and this is what I want to fill my picker view with. On view.did_load, I set my picker's data source to self. That indicates that my data source is going to come from this view controller class. Likewise, I set my picker delegate to self. So I'm essentially saying that my Uipicker view data source is my data source for the picker, and the Uipicker view delegate interface is my delegate interface for the picker. So now I have to implement some of the delegate members. And the first one I need to do is the number of components in the picker view. That's effectively the number of columns in the picker view. And we only need one column. And we'll see in the future that we may change this for other more complex tables. But for the picker, typically one column is used. You can, of course, use two, or as many as you like. The next thing we're interested in is the number of rows in the component. And this is going to be the count of the towns that we have in our data source. And then we're looking for the title for row. And this will get called when the picker is actually attempting to render the row. It wants to know what text we want in that particular row. And it passes the parameter row that it's looking for. So we just simply go to our towns array and get the town for that particular row. Then the last thing I implement, and this is not a required implementation, but something that we definitely want, is did_select_row. And this occurs when the user actually does make a selection and picks an item from the picker. And we're just going to log that. So we'll log the row and the town that the picker is showing at the time. So that's what we need to do. And there is a little bit of magic here, as you can see, in that we have set the data source and the delegate, and we kind of magically get these calls that the picker is going to use. But it's because we've set the picker data source and delegate elements and implemented those interfaces on our view controller. Otherwise, this wouldn't work at all. Okay, so let's give that a run and see how it works. So I do indeed have the towns that I'm interested in. And we'll select Burlington. And down in our logging, we can see that we picked row 3 and the text was Burlington. Okay, so that's the way we wanted it to work. Let's give ourselves some breakpoints so we can see how it puts itself together. And we'll run it again. You can see the first thing it wants to know is how many columns. And we're going to return 1 for the number of columns. And you can see I'm using the debug menu to continue. Second thing it wants to know is how many rows. We're going to give it the number of items in our towns array. And now it's going to go through and render itself. So it's going to render first for the row equal to 0. And we can see that down in our locals. And we're going to return that first item from the array. And then we'll increment and go for row 1. As you can see, it's going back and forth because it's attempting to show it to me. So I'm going to take this breakpoint off. And now we've got the picker. And finally, not while I'm spinning, but when the user releases, it'll actually give me the did select row. And it does pass me in the row equal to 4, which is the selection that I made. And we'll continue with that, and we show the log. So that's the sequence of events that you get when you're creating and populating the picker and when the user makes a selection. And we'll be using this kind of pattern when we get involved in tables and lists as well. And in particular, we'll be looking at the UI table view in the next lesson.